Welcome back to the Historical Raven channel. I'm Raven, they, them, and this is Pop Culture, Nerdom, and History, where we explore the intersection of history and your favorite fictional series. Before we begin, I'd like to add a content warning here. While these topics won't be the focus of the episode, we will be discussing wars, battles, and abuses of power such as military strength used on civilian populations and mentions of genocide. I won't be going into any real details, but I'd rather we go in knowing what the discussion is about. To BBY, undisclosed location. Mon Mothma stands in the bridge of the Ghost, surrounded by the crew of the ship and members of Gold Squadron. Using the droid C-11OP, better known as Chopper, the senator broadcasts a speech in which she announces her resignation from the Galactic Senate and a formal declaration of war against the Emperor and the Empire. Along with the speech, a declaration of rebellion is transmitted across the galaxy. It reads, "We, the beings of the Rebel Alliance, do this day send forth this declaration to His Majesty the Emperor, and to all sentient beings in the galaxy, to make clear to all the purposes and goals of this rebellion. We firmly acknowledge the importance and necessity of the institution of galactic government. We accept that all must subjugate themselves to that government, giving up certain rights and freedoms in return for peace, prosperity, and happiness for all. We believe that the galactic government derives its power and right to rule from the consent of the governed. We believe that should the right of free beings be willfully and malignantly usurped, it is the unalienable right of said beings to alter or abolish said government. We believe that the Galactic Empire has willfully and malignantly usurped the rights of the free beings of the galaxy, and therefore it is our unalienable right to abolish it from the galaxy. We do not take this course lightly. Governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, but when a government displays a history of usurpation, abuse, and moral atrocity, displaying a clear design to subjugate totally and absolutely beings born free under the auspices of nature, it is our right, our duty, to dispose of that government. The history of the present galactic empire is of repeated injuries upon its members, with the direct objective of establishing you, Emperor Palpatine, and as absolute tyrant over the galaxy. You have disbanded the Senate, the voice of the people. You have instituted a policy of blatant speciesism and genocide against the non-human peoples of the galaxy. You have overthrown the chosen leaders of planets, replacing them with moffs and governors of your choice. You have raised taxes without the consent of those taxed. You have murdered and imprisoned millions without benefit of trial. You have unlawfully taken land and property. You have expanded the military far beyond what is necessary and prudent for the sole purpose of oppressing your subjects. We, the Rebel Alliance, do therefore, in the name and by the authority of the free beings of the galaxy, do solemnly publish and declare our intentions to fight and oppose you and your forces by any and all means at our disposal, to refuse any imperial law contrary to the rights of free beings, to bring about your destruction and the destruction of the galactic empire, to make forever free all beings in the galaxy. To these ends, we pledge our property, our honor, and our lives." Going point by point, we'll start with the disbandment of the Senate. While this isn't true on paper at this point, it is in practice. Even before the rise of the Galactic Empire, Chancellor Palpatine had been consolidating power. Over the 3 years of the Clone Wars, the Senate gave more and more emergency powers to Palpatine in response to various crises. These start with the proposal by Representative Bings in 22 BBY, but continue throughout the war, as will be discussed here later. In 5 BBY, Mon Mothma is seen giving a speech to the Senate to help people in need. Most of the senators, and we're not really talking about a whole lot in the audience, are either actively ignoring her or heckling her. The bill she is proposing never gets anywhere. By the time the declaration was released, Much of the power that was once held by the Senate lies in the hands of individual governors. Senator Dillhausen, a loyalist to Palpatine, is quoted saying, quote, "The Senate increasingly resembles a rigged casino. Given that Palpatine always wins the political games, it seems pointless to play unless you can also secure your own prizes at the same time." On the topic of genocide, there is, of course, the extermination of the Jedi Order at the end of the Clone Wars, also known as the Great Jedi Purge. This lasted from 19 BBY to 3 BBY, ending with the seeming death of Ahsoka Tano. The first day of the Purge saw thousands of Jedi murdered, regardless of age or participation in the war and the insurrection. A year later, in 18 BBY, the Emperor sent Moff Wilhelm Tarkin to Antar 4, a former separatist world. His orders were to pacify any separatist uprising, and chose Antar 4 to make an example. Tarkin invaded the world and carried out his orders, arresting and executing people and massacring anyone who fought back. Tarkin made no attempt to separate Imperial loyalists from suspected separatists. Possibly the largest genocide on the minds of Mon Mothma and other rebels was the sterilization of Geonosis in 9 BBY. This occurred during the second occupation of the planet, though not directly ordered by Palpatine himself. Instead, Grand Moff Tarkin ordered the Imperial Weapons Division to kill all beings on the planet after location of the Death Star above Geonosis was discovered. The Imperials used an insecticide in a gaseous form to kill the Geonosians. Nearly 100 billion beings died as a result of this atrocity, and the entire species would go extinct only a few decades later when the last queen died without her own brood. Months before the end of the Clone Wars, the Galactic Constitution was amended by the Sector Governance Decree, or the Sector Control Decree, that gave Palpatine the power to remove sector governors that he was displeased with and put in governors loyal to him. This was used multiple times between 19 BBY and 2 BBY, which included the replacement of the Lothal governor, Ryder Azadi, who was replaced by Arinda Price and Moff Stada. The improper imprisonment of beings included the arrest of 63 senators the day after the formation of the Galactic Empire. These senators, members of the delegation of 2,000 who wanted to limit the powers of the Galactic Chancellor, were charged with conspiracy and treason. The arrests were executed by the Imperial Intelligence Service and reported on by Holonet News. Among those detained, but not arrested, were Mon Mothma herself and Bail Organa. Those arrested included Shea Sadeshhasa of Herdessa, Ivor Drake of Kestos Minor, Fang Zar of CERN Prime, Stream Drinker of Tyna, Tanner Cataman of Phoenix, and Ni Alavar of Lord. More than a decade before Mon Mothma's speech, Ephraim and Mira Bridger were arrested and convicted of treason, along with Lothal's then governor Ryder Azadi. The Bridgers had been broadcasting anti-imperial messages to Lothal and other nearby systems, and while Azadi had been tasked with rooting out the Bridgers, he was a supporter of the couple and was arrested for it. Admiral Edmund Rampart is another person who was imprisoned and thrown to the side at the whim of the Emperor. Despite the bombardment of Tapoka City being part of the effort to suppress the Kaminoan uprising, Admiral Rampart is accused of destroying the city for his own personal agenda. Rampart had been ordered by his superiors to destroy the city, thereby killing everyone in Tapoka City. The stealing of property and land includes the Syndulla estate, which Admiral Thrawn used as his base. The Ryloth insurgency had been raging since the end of the Clone Wars. The estate had been occupied twice during this time in reprisal for Cham Syndulla's resistance to the Empire. In a different section of the galaxy, the ISB took over a hotel during the investigation and crackdown into Cassian Andor, the Resistance, and Ferrix in 5 BBY. 2 years later, the Empire forcibly removed the entire population of the planet Ariel after finding sources of radiation the planet hadn't previously reported. The planet, now vacant of beings, was used to build factories across it. The citizens of Ariel were given 6 weeks and no compensation to move. To the point of the military, the end of the Clone Wars was meant to be the end of hostilities. The Emergency Powers Act, first enacted in 24 BBY, expanded in 22 BBY, and then amended further at a later date, was originally passed so the Chancellor at the time, Palpatine, could remain in office during the Separatist crisis. In 22 BBY, this act was expanded to give Palpatine the power to form the Grand Army of the Republic. Later in the Clone Wars, the Reflex Amendment was passed, which gave Palpatine near full control over the military, which was previously held by the Senate. The power Palpatine held at the end of the Clone Wars through the Cold War and into the Galactic Civil War meant that he increased the military from 3 million troopers and a few thousand capital ships to 25,000 Star Destroyers and 1.1 billion stormtroopers. These Star Destroyers were deployed throughout the galaxy, a permanent reminder of the Empire's power. Planets like Raxus Secundus and Sereno, the former Separatist capital and Count Dooku's home world respectively, were among the first to feel the growing power of the Imperial military. I know I skipped the question of taxation. It was impossible to find. Finding information about taxation in Star Wars is even more difficult than finding the exact number of starships in a battle. At least then, there's a minimum number of ships. What information there has come has come from tabletop RPGs, and while I use one tabletop RPG as a source, The Collapse of the Republic, that information is also found online. The information concerning taxation is not. July 8th, 1776, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Colonel John Nixon, a member of the militia called the Philadelphia Associators, stands in front of the Pennsylvania State House, now Independence Hall, facing the gathered crowd milling around the yard. The State House bell had rung minutes before, at noon, calling people to him. Happy no one else was going to show up, he lifts the broadside handed to him earlier that day and speaks, ensuring everyone can hear him. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station of which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitles them, a decent respect to the opinion of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. By when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariable the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government. and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter the former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of absolute tyranny over these states. 5 minutes later, Colonel Nixon finishes his speech and thanks the gathered crowd. He had just finished the first public reading of the Declaration of Independence, listing the 27 grievances against the king for all to hear. But this wouldn't be the last time this document would be read aloud, including a reading in front of the Continental Army by General George Washington. Among these grievances were the governors the king appointed ignoring colonists' wishes, including expansion, obstructing migration from countries not within Great Britain, such as Germany, keeping a large military force in the colonies during times of peace, the forced quartering of soldiers amongst the citizens, quote, imposing taxes on us without our consent, end quote, refusing jury trials, and suspending colonial legislatures. As with the Declaration of Rebellion, we'll discuss these charges point by point in order. In 1763, the French and Indian War ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. Months later, the Proclamation Line of 1763 was created between the British colonies on the Atlantic coast and the French further inland, with the border following the Appalachian Mountains. While this border wasn't a hard line that couldn't be crossed at all, it was designed to allow the king and parliament to control settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. The colonists weren't happy with this. They wanted to expand as they wished, despite that having caused the issues that preceded the French and Indian Wars. According to the proclamation, only crown officials could make land purchases, quote, at some public meeting or assembly of the said Indians, end quote. This meant that individuals or companies that wanted to buy land west of the mountains had to request permission to buy that land. However, these requests were denied by the king and the answer given to the colonists by the governors. In the first century and a half of the British North American colony's existence, increasing the number of colonists was a top priority. According to John Holland, an English nobleman, immigration would, quote, enlarge the honor and glory of the king, enlarge the trade of the kingdom, and weaken our increasing neighbors that may possibly become the worst of our enemies, end quote. To this end, both Parliament and the colonies sought to increase immigration to the colonies. In 1757, the Georgia Assembly passed an immigration law to increase the security of the colony. However, Parliament and King George III would feel threatened by the increased population in the colonies deeper into the 18th century and as the colonies were pushed closer to rebellion. Particularly concerning to Parliament and the King were immigrants from the German states, whose military skills were greatly valued and where the ideals of political freedom were on the rise. This push to restrict immigration wasn't the only way Parliament and the King sought to restrict the power of immigrants. The king also pushed laws to ensure new immigrants were unable to own land. This barrier to owning land ensured that new immigrants were unable to vote, as only landowners were allowed that right. Also, after the French and Indian War, England decided to keep a contingent of soldiers within the colonies. In London, this contingent was seen as a way to secure the borders. On top of this, Parliament was looking to tighten their control of their empire, which meant a presence of soldiers in all colonies. This would be made official in the Quartering Act of 1765, in which soldiers would be staying in the colonies at the cost of colonial legislators, by the legislators supplying barracks and accommodations for the soldiers. In Boston, this led to a confrontation between colonial leaders who pushed the soldiers' barracks further away from the city, and British officers who wanted the barracks closer to the city center. The growing animosity between colonists in the British Army led to multiple conflicts, including the Boston Massacre, in which a large crowd of colonists surrounded and pelted a small group of British soldiers with rocks and ice, and which resulted in the deaths of 5 colonists. Among other incidents, which will be discussed later, this led to the Coercive Acts, the last of which was the Quartering Act of 1774. This act applied to all colonies and allowed royal governors, rather than the colonial legislatures, to find housing and supplies for British soldiers. And unlike the legislatures, the governors were more willing to quarter soldiers within the towns and cities rather than on the outskirts. This act also clarified where soldiers could be quartered. These included, quote, uninhabited houses, outhouses, barns, or other buildings, end quote. Importantly, both quartering acts strictly prohibited soldiers from occupying private homes. Concurrent with the above, the British government also needed to raise funds to pay off debts it had accrued during the French and Indian War. By the end of the war, Great Britain's debt had risen from £75 million to £133 million. As a way to help pay off this debt, and after raising taxes in Britain, Parliament started taxing the colonies. This taxation included the Sugar and Stamp Acts. Taxation acts, such as the Sugar Act, had been passed prior to 1774, but they were rarely enforced and rarely affected the daily life of North American colonists. Now, however, the colonists were forced to pay these taxes, but had no say in it. This upset the colonists, some of whom had read James Otis's pamphlet, The Rights of the British Colonies Asserted and Proved. This pamphlet argued, quote, no part of His Majesty's dominions can be taxed without their consent, that every part has a right to be represented in the supreme or some subordinate legislature, end quote. On top of this, colonists had become accustomed to voting for their local and colonial leaders over multiple generations, and these local and colonial leaders enacted their own laws and taxes. In Parliament, the argument was that colonists, like other British subjects on the island that didn't have a vote, which included cities such as Birmingham and Manchester, had, quote, virtual representation, end quote. The argument further went that all ministers of Parliament legislated for all British subjects, even if they didn't come from those MPs' districts. Ultimately, Parliament would vote to give the colonies representation, but this wouldn't come until 1778, much too late. Included in the 1765 Stamp Act was a provision that stated colonists who were charged with violating the Stamp Act would appear in admiralty courts. Admiralty courts dealt with maritime issues and, importantly for the colonists, saw the judge also be the jury. This took away the right to a jury trial that was given to British subjects in the 1215 Magna Carta and reaffirmed in the 1689 British Bill of Rights. The judges in these courts had the power to name the register and officials, while also designating surrogates for other ports if he was unable to attend in person. Under the Currency Act of 1764, this meant North American colonists had to travel to Nova Scotia for trial under an admiralty court, even if they were in Georgia. When the Townshend Acts were introduced in 1767, multiple colonial assemblies responded by either denouncing the taxes included in the Townshend Act or passed resolutions that stated, in the case of the Virginian House of Burgesses, quote, the sole right of imposing taxes on the inhabitants of this His Majesty's colony and dominion of Virginia is now and ever hath been legally and constitutionally vested in the House of Burgesses, end quote. The response to these efforts was for the royal governors to suspend or dissolve their legislatures. 7 years later, in response to the Boston Tea Party, the Massachusetts Government Act was passed by Parliament. This act ended town meetings and changed the colony's charter to place it under royal control. When the Virginia House of Burgesses passed a resolution to support Massachusetts, the governor once again dissolved the legislature. I could continue, but we might be here for hours, and no one wants that, least of all myself. If you made it this far, even if it's just to watch the race, I thank you. If you've enjoyed either the lecture, and yeah, almost 3,500 words is a lecture, or the race, give me a like. I hope you found some of what I said interesting and that you want to learn more. That's all from me. Have a good day, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.